Okay, I'm Sean McInnes. I am the Sustainability Coordinator for UNC Greensboro, and thank you for joining us to hear Dr. Kevin Wilcox's presentation today. Dr. Wilcox is an associate professor in the UNCG Department of Biology, where he teaches conservation biology and plant diversity courses, and he runs the Predictive Plant Ecology Lab. The lab's research focuses on the impacts of climate change and other anthropogenic factors on various ecosystem properties and processes, including hydrologic regimes, eutrophication, which if I had to look that up, that's the increase of nutrients into water systems. So think of algae blooms and stuff like that that are caused by our fertilizers and all kinds of chemicals that we spray on our plants. And then, of course, the homogenization of landscapes. And ultimately, the lab's goal is to better understand and predict how communities and ecosystems interact and how they will respond under global change scenarios at spatial scales relevant for land management. He also serves as the chair of the Peabody Park Preservation Committee, which is charged with restoring the natural habitats of the campus park woods and Piedmont prairie. Okay, thank you all again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kevin Wilcox.
All right. Hey, thanks, Sean. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for being here. Let me just share my whole screen. I'll be kind of switching back and forth a little bit, but all right. So as Sean mentioned, my name's Kevin Wilcox, and I'm with biology here at UNCG. I chose this photo for my talk. So the title of my talk is Human-Fire Relationships. It's complicated. And I chose this photo. This is a colleague of mine that I work with in South Africa, savannas there. And as you can see, he's using a drip torch to start a fire, essentially. And I love this photo because it causes numerous emotions. My first gut reaction is, Isaac, you got to leave. Like, that fire is coming for you. Get out of there, right? It's like a sense of danger. But then the second thing I notice is how calm he is, right? He knows what he's doing. He's done this before. He's in control of what's happening, right? And so he's not panicked. And because he knows what he's doing, he's able to shape the environment around him to help preserve this system, which is a savanna system in Kruger National Park. So I'll talk a little bit about some research that we're doing there at the end of the talk, but I just want to start out with this photo here because I like it. All right, and so before I really get into fire per se, I do like to start these types of things with a little information about me and my research program. We all have biases that we go into things with, and it's always nice for you to know what my biases are. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest here in the US, up about 30 minutes north of Seattle. I spent a lot of my time as a young person hiking around the Cascade Mountains. Here's a picture of me, my 18-year-old self with my dog, hiking through the beautiful forests in the Cascade Mountains. Here's another shot from that landscape. It's a little bit different. This is up near Mount Rainier. And you can see, we start to have some more open ecosystems up in the Alpine range. After my undergraduate work or degree, I went out and I spent 2 years sampling the understory vegetation up in the Cascade Mountains as part of this big project that was exploring how different timber regimes could be used to maximize recovery of these systems after logging. So that was a lot of fun, 2 years of camping. And then right before grad school, I spent about 3 or 4 months in Puerto Rico in the rainforest there at the Luquillo Long-Term Ecological Research Station there. So all of this to say, I started out as a real tree guy. So much so that, when I was looking for graduate school or where to go, I started looking around at different research programs, and I found one by my eventual PhD advisor, but he studied grass. And I said, grass? I'm not a grass person, I'm a tree guy, right? But then I talked to him on the phone and went and visited, and he eventually convinced me to come visit tallgrass prairie in eastern Kansas. And so here's a picture of the Kansas Prairie Biological Station. And I spent one summer here, and I fell in love with tallgrass prairie and grasslands in general. The hills are emerald green. The biodiversity there is fantastic. There's so many complex dynamics in this system that really kind of caused me to fall in love with it. So from then on, I was no longer a tree person. I was a grass person. So I went around and I studied all kinds of different grasslands: short grass prairie in Colorado, northern mixed grass prairie in Montana and Wyoming, tall grass prairie in Kansas, and then in South Africa, the savanna grasslands in Kruger National Park. And so a lot of what I focus on is how weather patterns drive functioning in these systems, but also herbivores and fire as well. Right, and then I collect a bunch of data when I'm out there, and then I write what I think are exciting, but other people might think are boring papers on all of these things. And that's kind of how my research program exists. So the three major drivers I think about when I'm thinking about these systems, these ecosystems, are herbivory by either large ungulates or even by insects, things like droughts. So this is a picture of that's a Cape buffalo up on the top left there. On the bottom, I'm showing a picture of a drought shelter, which is a way we experiment on reduced rainfall to simulate a drought. And then fire, right? And fire is a big part of my research program. This is a picture, again, I'll talk about this at the end a little bit, but this is a picture of some of our fire treatments that we imposed in August of last year in Kruger National Park. So in 2023, I came to UNCG. I started here. I was in Wyoming before this. And I immediately got involved with the Peabody Park Committee, which, as Sean mentioned, a large part of what that committee does is to make sure that our natural areas are preserved, specifically on campus. And one of these areas really spoke to me when I first got here, and this was this Piedmont prairie restoration area. And this is a photo from a control burn that we imposed back in January of this year. And you can see a lot of the vegetation was burning at this time. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the future, but just to kind of center us and to talk about, well, what we're going to talk about for the rest of this time. I'm going to go through a pretty brief history of humans and fire. I'm then going to talk about the benefits of fire for landscapes. I'm going to talk about when fire becomes problematic. These are typically the things that we hear about in the news. And then I want to end by thinking and potentially talking about directions forward. So at this point, I want to pause and I want to get some crowd participation here. And it's going to be painless, I promise. So let's see. Okay, so I'm pulling up this. Okay, can everybody see that that QR code? If you can, someone gives me a thumbs up if you can see it.
We can see it, Kevin.
Awesome. Great. All right, can you pull up either like on your phone, just pull up this QR code and it should take you right to just a little form. And you can put in some responses here. Think of the last time you heard or read about fire. What did you feel at that exact moment? The other way you can do it if the QR code isn't working, you can go to just menti.com and enter that use code right at the top. Nice. Necessity, fear, loss, fascination, danger. You guys are good at this. This whole crowd participation thing. Fear, yeah. A lot of fear, a lot of danger. Yeah, a lot of fear. Now that's what I think of when I hear about these things in the news. Okay, great. It looks like a lot of people came in here and participated. Okay, so the next one, I think if you, let's see. Okay, so if you continue on, now think about the last time you were around a fire. So by experience, I just mean you actually interacted with fire. What did you feel then? Scared. Sounds like a hard one. Warmth, awe, yeah. So some positive things coming in, then but still some negative, yeah. More warmth. Yeah, hesitancy, I like that. Shows a healthy respect. Satisfied, yeah, I like that one. Yeah, so now we're seeing a little more of a mixed response, right? And and part of that, I would argue, right, is that there are certainly times when we experience fire where it's out of control, right? And that is where I think the scariness comes from. But when we're in control, there's a different, I guess, connection with fire. Right? And I think that has a lot to do with the different responses in these two categories. All right, I'm going to switch back now for participating, everybody. All right. Now I wanted to transition into the content here. And again, this is going to be a brief overview of humans and the history of fire. And I'll start out by saying I am not an anthropologist by any stretch of the imagination. I study how fire interacts with environment. But I thought it would be helpful here to really talk about where we come from a fire standpoint. And so there's a bit of debate here. It was kind of fun diving into this because people get really into when humans first controlled fire. There's a lot of controversy around this. Some reports say it's about 1.6 million years ago. And these reports often come from these caves that they found in South Africa. So the Swartkrans cave is in South Africa, the northern part of the country. And what they found in there, here's a figure in the middle showing the overhead of this cave. And then on the right here, the lower number in each of these grids is how many bone fragments they found in each of these spots. And then the upper number is how many charred bone fragments they found in each of these squares, right? And so there's not a ton of them, but there are a fair number of charred bone fragments in these areas. And with some chemical analyses, they were able to show that the breakdown of the chemicals and compounds in the bones was caused by a campfire-like intensity, right? So we're putting kind of pieces together. However, there's a lot of debate about that. Some people think it could have happened because of a lightning fire, things like that. There are some data from the Wonderwork cave, which is also in South Africa, where plant and animal ash was found 30 meters inside the cave. What the authors argue that is far enough inside that it wouldn't actually caused by a lightning strike. But certainly by about 800,000 years ago, humans were using fire to cook with, for warmth, for anti-predator type activities and things like that. So that was a long time ago, right? Even 800,000 years ago is a long time ago, right? It's the year 2000 right now. So if you times that by many, then you get to 800,000. So it's a long time, long history of humans using fire. Another thing people do instead of just, or in addition to cooking and warmth, humans have been using fire for a long time to shape landscapes around them. You know, this often happened as people were clearing land for hunting in tropical Africa. There was small scale burning that some people have called cultural burning in North American indigenous populations, where small patches of land were burned to promote the growth of certain plants, like medicinal plants. And then in the northern Great Plains, you have large fires were lit to drive bison herds and even herd grasshoppers in some respects, right? And so humans were using this to alter the landscape for quite some time. And this graph right here is from a paper from Schliske and others in 2008. And it shows pretty nicely the extent of fire-dependent ecosystems around the world. So everything in yellow here is an ecosystem that depends on fire to exist as it currently is, right? All the green, alternately, are systems that would not exist if fire was too frequent. Right? So there's this dichotomy between fire sensitive and fire dependent systems across the globe. Okay, so now I wanted to transition into the benefits of fire for landscapes. We're going to talk about kind of the dangers of fire in a little bit, but it's important to first recognize that fire does a lot of good things. This is the background photo here is of Kanza prairie. Again, this is where I did a lot of my work and still do a fair amount of work. But it's showing a herd of bison that are grazing in this area that has recently burned. So typically, after a fire comes through, you have increased light availability getting to the plants in the springtime. You have this nutrient pulse that happens in the soil. So a lot of the microbes kind of go hyperactive and they really put out a lot of nutrients. Those plants take up those nutrients, and this drives these emerald hills that exist. And this picture on the bottom left kind of shows that, right? And then herbivores will follow this. In fact, in the Serengeti, there's something called the green wave hypothesis that dictates that as the rains come in and fire comes through a system, this wave of green exists or kind of travels throughout the Serengeti, driving the massive wildebeest migrations, right? And so this is a really powerful thing for ecosystem. It's also really important to have these open areas for a number of wildlife, including the eastern meadowlark, showing in the bottom right there. If we look at some data, well, let's start out with this picture here. So this is a nice example from Kanza Prairie that contrasts an area that's burned every single year and an area that's unburned, right? So this Kanza Prairie is this watershed level experiment where they have all of these different treatments acting on large pieces of land. And this really showcases the importance of fire here, right? So this is an area that's been kind of taken over by a lot of woody and tree species. And, different things live in this area than just across the fire break here into the annually burned area. And if we look by itself, right, if we look just at fire without considering herbivores or anything like that, we get a figure or a pattern that looks like the figure on the left, right? So on the x-axis here, we have the number of fires that have burned in a set amount of time. I can't remember exactly how many years this is, but I think it was around 20 years. So over on the right here, we have very frequent fire. And over on the left here, we have very infrequent fire. And on the y-axis, we have heterogeneity. This is kind of something a lot of land managers care about, right? You want to increase heterogeneity of your landscape. This increases the habitat for wildlife and a variety of other things. And so what we see is actually fire, in this case, isn't that good, right? It's actually reducing the heterogeneity that exists in these systems. But again, this is in the absence of large herbivores on the landscape. When you add in herbivores on the landscape, so like I said before, when you burn an area, oftentimes you have large herbivores come in and eat biomass. And actually what happens when you add that in is is you have native species richness, which is the number of plant species in this case in a certain area. And you see that with that grazing impact, either by native grazers like bison or cattle, we see a drastic increase in the biodiversity in these systems. And so if you combine fire and herbivores together, you see a positive effect of fire on the landscape of diversity. The other thing that I wanted to point out here, this is a PhD student in my lab, Joshua Adjawele, who's been doing a lot of great work thinking about the timing and the frequency of fire. And what he showed here in this figure is when you have fire come through every single year, it really impacts how stable the system is, right? Stability in a system is important for herbivores, for habitat, for wildlife, for people managing the land, right? So you want to increase the stability of a landscape if you can. And what Joshua found was that when you have fire coming through every single year, it's not as good for stability as if you have a rotational fire. Right, so if fire comes in a patchy way in the landscape, that increases the stability of the system overall. He's working with a specific management technique called pyrrhic herbivory, or also patchburn grazing. All right, we're going to come away from Kansas and more local. And I want to talk a little bit about some ecosystems that are maintained by fire. Right, so this is a picture right here of one former PhD student and one current PhD candidate here at UNCG, taking some ecological data in longleaf pine. And so I'll just start out with this quote because I think it describes the system pretty well. So the quote is, "The distinctive roar of the longleaf was the sound that evening breeze made, and the odor of pine resin was the smell of the countryside. It was so much a part of their lives, so wound up with everything it meant to be Southern, that it was as impossible to discern its influence as it was to imagine a world without it. Only was it when it was reduced almost entirely to a sea of stumps could we begin to get our arms around it." And that quote really, it impacts me because it kind of reminds me that a lot of these systems have been lost, right? And then the value that they brought to us has also been lost at the same time. In addition to just, I guess, a sentiment that we feel, it also provides a number of services to us. So it provides habitat for important wildlife species like the red cockaded woodpecker, depends on longleaf pine for roosting space and also its nests. The seeds from the cones are an important food source for fox squirrels, and a more direct service it provides, well, in the past, right, its sap was actually used to make tar for shipbuilding back when we were building our ships out of tar. Which is kind of a fun fact. And the reason that longleaf pine it does so well in fire is largely down to the longleaf pine itself, the species Pinus palustris. And part of this is that this species has multiple life stages. The first life stage of longleaf pine is a grass stage. This occurs from germination up to about 7 years. A lot of these individuals will just lie in wait until the right time arrives, and then they can shoot up. But these almost look like grasses. If you're walking around, it would look like a bunch grass coming out here. So they don't really develop a stem. They all their needles here coming out of fascicles out of the base they're coming out of the ground or out of this kind of crown tissue. This is pretty rare. This doesn't happen very often for many trees. There's also a lot of root growth happening at this time, and it's kind of preparing for these later stages in life. It also bounces back well after fire. The second stage is what often people call the bottle brush stage. You can kind of, you can kind of see why it's called the bottle brush stage. It usually occurs when the diameter at ground level of that grass stage gets to a certain size. Then all of a sudden it'll shoot up. And so it puts all these resources it's been storing and it caches them in and it shoots up as fast as it possibly can. It can actually grow multiple feet in a few months, right? And it does that because it needs to get above something that we call a fire trap, right? When a fire comes through, depending on how much litter buildup there is, and we'll talk about that later, but when a fire comes through, the flame height, anything in that flame height is likely to get damaged, right? And so if a plant or a tree in this case can get above that height, right, then they can survive usually. And so that's what we mean by getting above that fire trap. It's relatively susceptible to fire at this stage. There's pretty thin bark, so it really relies on growing fast and developing that bark thickness around so that it can survive a fire that's coming. All right, if it successfully navigates that, if it gets past that bottle brush stage, when it gets to about 6 to 10 feet, so if your metric, if your preference is metric, you could say 2 to 3 meters. At this stage, lateral branches start forming. It still has grown pretty fast. It grows about 3 feet a year. And then once it's about 8 feet tall and about 2 inches in diameter, it's pretty fire resistant, meaning a fire can come through as long as it's not a crown fire or it's too intense of a fire, and it will survive that event. And then finally, you get to the adult stage. So the adult stage trees are usually what people think of when they think about longleaf pine. The roots extend extraordinarily far from the trunk, up to 75 feet. There's a nice picture here from the History Society in Durham that shows an excavation of this root network. And this helps it both hold steady during wind events, but it also helps take up nutrients and moisture. The fire interval in these systems is about 3 to 7 years, and that clears the understory for germination. It also keeps that fire height from getting too high when fires do come through. The other ecosystem I'd like to touch on here that's local is the Piedmont prairie. So this is the system that really captured my imagination when I first got to North Carolina. And part of it is because there's a wonderful diversity in systems. They're usually a mixture of both trees and herbaceous vegetation like grasses. Here's one on the left from Northern Virginia. Here's a Piedmont prairie system over at Duke in their botanical gardens over there. And actually, this ecosystem type, the Piedmont prairie, right, used to be much more extensive than it is today. This is a map from some of the early European explorers when they came over from Europe, and they tried to map everything out, right? And so if you look at the southeastern United States, you'll find things like this kind of littered throughout. Things called the Grand Savanne, or I think this was a Spanish explorer, so it'd be Grande Savanne, translating to the Grand Savanna. But now, because of a loss of fire and change in land use, we've actually seen substantial reductions in these open landscapes. Oh, and I'll also say, sorry, these were attributed, the reason these existed was because of indigenous populations using fire to manage these systems so that bison would come in and visit these areas. They also had their own agriculture that they were supporting in these areas through the use of fire. But now, because fire has largely been lost from the landscape, as well as changes to other land use types, we've seen loss of a lot of these systems. About 97% of longleaf savannas have been lost in the southeastern United States. 90% of Piedmont prairie has been lost, and that's kind of a conservative estimate. A lot of Piedmont prairies now exist in strips where power lines exist or roadsides. Almost uniformly, we've lost these large expanses of prairie. Here's a study that used some carbon isotopes to look at this a little more closely. So this is an area right here where they had assumed that there was a Piedmont prairie system, right? And you can see from this satellite image that most of it is now forested, right? You have this cut right here, which are power lines. But so what this study did was they went out and they sampled 4 locations throughout this area. And they said, all right, if we can use carbon isotopes through the depth profile in the soil, we can start to understand how much closed canopy there was, how much open C3 grasses, and then C3, C4 mixed grasses. And I won't get into the details here, but basically anything to the left of this line here is a closed canopy, and everything to the right here is an open, more savanna type system. And these different colors correspond to the different sampling points within this region. And the farther, the deeper you get in the soil profile, the longer ago it generally was, right? And they have the dates here as well. But what you can see is this whole area, right, has really transitioned for the last 2,000 or so years from an open state to a closed canopy state. So this is a real big change for this system. And a lot of this comes down to fire again. So this is a map by Guyette and others in 2012. And what they did in this study is they mapped out the fire return intervals across the United States. And so the darker orange colors here represent fire intervals that are shorter. Right? So this darkish maroon, well, I guess it's not maroon, burnt orange color represents fire return intervals of less than 2. So that means 1 fire every 2 years, so quite high. And in some of these longer areas, right, in the alpine regions and really dry regions, you don't have fire coming through very frequently. Right, and so the southeastern United States had quite a bit of a higher fire return interval than it does today. And largely that's probably why we've lost a lot of these open ecosystems. And we care about this because there's a lot of species that rely on these systems to exist. I'm a plant person, so I think about these guys quite a bit, but a lot of these are endangered species or threatened at least. And they rely on these open ecosystems to survive. This includes smooth coneflower, Carolina trefoil, Georgia aster, Schweinitz's sunflower. But it's also really important for pollinators like the rusty-patched bumblebee, pipevine swallowtails, and a whole bunch of birds. A couple of my favorites being the eastern meadowlark and the bobolink. And so as we are losing these systems, we're also losing habitat for these important species. And so what we're trying to do here at UNCG, and many people are trying to do this from around the state and around the region, is to restore some of these areas to provide habitat. So you can see here on the left, this is us lighting that controlled burn in January here on campus. You probably saw the many notifications that went out begging people not to call the authorities when they see smoke. This is a figure of my daughter standing right in front of this really tall Piedmont prairie stretch, but it's late in the fall, and so it's not really blooming anymore. So I wanted to include one. Wildflowers in these regions are beautiful and really important habitat for pollinators. So the things that we're trying to do is to restore these systems back to their natural state. All right, so that was a lot of good things about fire, but again, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about what happens when fire gets out of control and when fire becomes a problem. Right, so this is a photo from ABC News that was showing one of the fires in Los Angeles that were happening in January, right? This was a really important tragedy. A lot of people lost homes, people died. So these types of things happen with fire, and it's important to think about when and why. Part of the reason fire gets out of control is due to mismanagement. And this is a figure right here of the ponderosa pine forest. So these are similar-ish to our longleaf pines, slightly different dynamics. But on the western side of the U.S., you have these areas. This is a healthy ponderosa pine forest where you have big trees and large gaps in between those trees, and not too much litter buildup here, right? And this leads to these ground fires going through periodically and burning off the brush. Ponderosa pines have serotinous cones, which germinate after fire. And yeah, this is a healthy system. The alternative, though, and we see this in a lot of Western forests, and we have for quite some time, thank you, Smokey the Bear, is a buildup of fuels in these forests, right? So now all of a sudden, instead of this open area on the ground, you have these ladder fuels. And then when these do eventually burn, as they all do, that fire can pop right up into the canopy, and then you get a canopy reducing fire. And the whole system has to start from scratch, which is not a good thing. Right, and this is a clear example of how mismanagement can lead to harmful fire, right? If these lower intensity fires had been kept going during the 80s and 90s, right, then you wouldn't have these types of events happening nearly as frequently as they are currently. The other thing that's important, though, to understand is that the history of fire is really important. You know, not all landscapes are fire adapted, right? The ponderosa pine, the longleaf pine forest, savannas, they are all fire adapted. They need fire to survive, right? But areas like the sagebrush in the Great Basin of the United States, right? These systems are not adapted to fire. And a lot of this has to do with their history of fire. Sagebrush is this bush right here. And sagebrush does not resprout after fire. It takes decades and decades for a sagebrush step to recover after fire. So afterwards, you have a lot of bare space. And this opens up room for invaders like cheatgrass to come in and take over. And then a positive feedback happens with this, is that cheatgrass, it turns out, is quite flammable. And so it greens up early in the spring, it browns down, and then by probably April, late April, May, it is dry as a bone out there. And if any kind of spark hits, that fire sweeps through again. And so it promotes its own existence by being flammable. And so that's a problem for a lot of wildlife in the system. So thinking about the history, before you just go burn, right, you've got to think, what is the history of fire in this system? Another thing that's happening, and it is attributed to us, but in more of an indirect way, is that we're seeing more and more of these things that I like to call compound extremes, right? And a lot of this has to do with climate change. We're having droughts happen more frequently. We're having heat waves happen more frequently. We're having buildup of fuels because of mismanagement of systems. And this means that fires can become more extreme than they typically are. And this is a picture from 2019, the firestorms that swept through large areas in Australia. And these areas came about because of exactly this. They had a heat wave that swept across large areas of the country, and it caused these conditions where when a fire did hit, the fuel, it lit up really fast, and it caused these fire tornadoes to exist all around, and it caused lots and lots of damage to people, right? And these perfect storms are happening more frequently because these kind of extreme climate events are also happening more frequently. All right, I wanted to transition a little bit here to a case study in Kruger National Park, where some students of mine are studying the effects of extreme fires like this in a savanna, in a system where fire is a normal occurrence and important for the existence of this system. This is an overhead view of from a rock called Matiki, where we used to climb up at the end of a long, hard field day, and we'd pack up a beer and crack it open as the sun went down, and looking over this savanna where there'd be elephants and rhinos and Cape buffalo kind of roaming around, right? So this is a beautiful savanna. You can see all this grass biomass all the way scattered through, trees through. And this system supports an amazing diversity of very charismatic megafauna, right? We have things like your leopard and lions and cheetahs, and my favorite, the kudu, elephants, Cape buffalo. We have impala and giraffe. Also, it hosts things like the mighty termite, which is super important, structuring the spatial heterogeneity in a savanna. We also have amazing insects there, like the shangololo, which is this wonderful millipede. This is a magnet that I always bring and put on my car, because every time I'm there, I will swerve off the road if there's a shangololo in it. They kind of invade the roads after the rain. So a really wonderful spot. This is what it looked like before a big drought swept through in 2015 and 2016. Right? These are happy zebras. There's lots of forage around. But then in 2015 and 2016, much of Southern Africa experienced an exceptional drought and really hot conditions. And this led to areas like this where everything was gone, but it also led to areas where there was a lot of biomass. It led to these areas that had thick, very dry fuel in this system. And so essentially, this drought was the most severe on record as far back as we have rainfall, 100 years. And so, one thing we're doing is we wanted to test what are the impacts of these compound extremes on savanna vegetation. And I won't go too much in detail here, but basically what we've been doing is we've been actually tagging all hundreds of plants in this system. And then we go out and we impose experimental treatments like drought. So we reduced rainfall for a couple years. We've been mimicking herbivory, and we've also mimicked an extreme fire where we've kind of stacked up woody and grass biomass in a way where we would expect a mismanagement of a system to kind of result in, and then we let it burn. And so we can compare what happens to the vegetation when you have a really hot fire versus a typical savanna fire. Okay? And then we're thinking about how diversity controls recovery. We're doing this with a fair number of different plant species, and these are some of the dominant grasses in the system. And to just give you just a quick, I guess, sense of the fire tolerance of these grasses they rely on fire. And part of the reason they rely on fire is because they kind of stockpile their reproductive tissue below ground, so that after a fire comes through, soil is actually amazingly insulating. And they can, as soon as that fire is done, they will put on new shoots and they will sprout kind of immediately. And so they're real fire tolerators. So we were tracking them. And then we started tracking these mini populations. This is my schematic. It's been not so lovingly called Kevin's cone because it's actually a pain to measure. So we went out and we measured how big was the canopy, how big was the base, how tall was it, how many tillers are in there. We also measured things like how many little buds does it have in their crown. And then we tagged them all and tracked them throughout all of these treatments. And I'm just going to walk us through our extreme fire treatment, since that's the subject of this lecture. But one of the things we are really interested in is how these grasses, which everyone thinks as being extremely resistant to fire, how do they respond to this severe fire that we might see in the future? And so what happened was 3 people in my lab went out and painstakingly buried soil temperature sensors at multiple depths in the soil. And they said, all right, we want to know what's happening in this area where the buds are, right, where a grass resprouts, because we don't really know much about that at all. And you can see here's an extreme fire treatment on the right where it's still burning. And here is an ambient fire. It's still burned, but it's on the left. I'm going to walk us through this, see if I can get it. Okay, so here's a video of that event right here. And we have, here is the ambient fire, here's the extreme fire. And this is the depth profile of temperature in the soil. Anything that's red is above 100 degrees Celsius. To give you context, anything above 65 C is going to kill the buds or the meristematic tissue. So you can see the fire coming through into this ambient fire plot. It really heats up the soil down here in from 0 to 1 centimeters, but it doesn't do much below that. Now the extreme fire treatment is really going now, or you can see it going there. And same thing kind of happens. It just heats up that top little slice of soil. But then as it keeps burning, sorry, it's a little choppy. As it keeps burning, you see the temperature starts to go deeper and deeper down into the soil, right? And this is getting to a point where we're starting to hit about 80, 90 degrees Celsius down a couple centimeters down, right? And this is really important from a grass standpoint because these grasses survive in this system because they store their critical organs down to a depth where it's not being impacted by temperature during these fires, right? Here's an extended graph where we look at it on a longer time scale. But every centimeter matters when you're a grass. And then what another student in my lab, Sophia Ronan, did is she tracked the recovery or the resprouting of all of these individuals that we had tagged and found that depending on which grass species you are, the probability of you surviving this event varied drastically by grass species, but also overall it was quite a bit lower under extreme fire versus ambient fire. So even these grasses that are thought to be extremely resistant to fire start suffering when you have these extreme events. And down here she's starting to link it with some characteristics that she measured of the grass. All right. So that's a lot of information and data, I know, but how do we move forward as a society, right, with all of this information? We know fires can be good and are critical in a lot of cases for ecosystems, but it also can be really harmful. So I don't know. I think what we really need to do is, as a society, we need to respect fire, understand what it can do, what it can do to us, but also what it can do for us, right? And we should act appropriately. The other thing that I think we need to do is we need to be continually assessing our management of systems, right? What worked in the past may not work in the future. We're having more droughts, more heat waves, CO2 is higher, things are just different now, right? So just because my grandfather did something a certain way doesn't mean that that's still the right way to do it. And then the third thing I think we need to do is we need to work together with local populations, agencies, governments to try to use data to inform how we manage ecosystems and deal with fire. All right, and so I'm just wrapping up with that. Yeah, more or less on time. My lab is fantastic. They are just such wonderful people, and a lot of this work is theirs. Right, I'm now just a paper pusher, unfortunately, and then a lot of the Kruger research, relies on a ton of people over in South Africa, as well as funding from the National Science Foundation, USDA, UNCG has supported a lot of this work as well, and so a lot of thanks go out to all of them, and thanks to you for showing up and listening.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. If you want to stop sharing, we can move into some Q&A. I know I have a couple questions, but does anybody who's joined us have any? Elena?
Hi, thanks for that. That was super interesting. I'm curious, coming from, so I live in Portland now, but for the last 10 years, I've lived in Napa, California, a county which has almost entirely burned, like in terms of square footage over the past decade. And so fire conversations around fire, forest management, grasslands management, fire safety are constant and really contentious. And I'm curious whether you see this field moving towards a consensus on what, proper, so to speak, forest management and grasslands management looks like in terms of fire safety, as we continue to push out into what some people like to call and some people don't like to call the wildland urban interface, what that conversation looks like from an academic standpoint, because certainly out here in the public, it's still really varied.
Yeah, that's such a great point and question that I think, we need to be addressing continually into the future. And I kind of touched on this in that last slide a little bit, in that I think that we need to be, well, one, a little humble, and two, adaptive, right? Because there often is not one, there's not a silver bullet. There's no one approach that's going to be the right approach for everything. At least this is my opinion. And part of that is because there's tough things we have to grapple with, right? What do you do if an area, right, needs to be cleared of fuel, needs a fire to come through it, but someone's house has been in there, right? What if that house has been in the family for generations? What if it's like, there's all kinds of human things that preclude us from doing what might be the best for the natural ecosystem. But the reality is that we live in these systems, and so we've got to find a way to come together. So, and then with the humility part, I think we just need to recognize that we don't know it all, right? And talk to each other, right? These, like you say, these things are very contentious often, and we need to listen and we need to consider everyone's viewpoint. I don't know, I guess that's how I'd respond, but I mean, there's not an answer that I know of.
Yeah, thank you.
Brian?
Sorry, that was a mistake. I accidentally hit the button.
Oh.
No,
you have to ask a question.
Well, I did actually have a question about your laboratory in Africa. Is it a permanent station, or is it one that's shared between multiple universities or units?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna put quotes on lab, because usually we're out there, like we were processing samples in a campground, right? We're like, a lot of the stuff we do there is in the field. And granted, there's like a fence around it, so there's not like lions prowling through the camp, but we do go to sleep hearing lions roaring in the distance, right? And so these areas are, they're for tourists as well, and we go over there and down. We do work with a few different universities. Northern Michigan University works with us. We're working with Harvard as well over there. There's a bunch of local universities too in South Africa. The University of KwaZulu-Natal is one of them. And so a lot of people working in Kruger National Park. Actually, I didn't mention this. Kruger National Park is the size of New Jersey. So it's a really big area. You have to go pretty slow in the park. So it takes 2 to 3 days to drive from the north to the south.
And what are your overall responsibilities on the Peabody Preservation Committee outside of the habitat restoration fire section of the park?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm chairing the thing. So, I'm kind of organizing and leveraging a lot of other people's expertise in the system, right? Because a lot of people have been working in this in this system for a long time, right? And so we really try to make sure that we utilize their knowledge, which is pretty vast. And yeah, so we organize 2 Ivy polls every single year, right? One of them is coming up on Friday, just to pitch that. If you want to come out, we're going to have, it'll be a good time. We'll have lemonade, we'll have water, we'll have fellowship, and we'll pull some ivy. But we do that, and then we also just make sure that we're preserving the whole park, which includes the woods, into the future.
Gotcha. Thanks for the info.
Just put a sign-up form if you're in Greensboro to help us with that form. Okay, Ellie's, I'll read this.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't able to introduce myself earlier, but I'm a junior majoring in information systems and supply chain management at UNCG. I'm attending because I was curious to learn more about fires, given the recent coverage of fire destruction on the West Coast and Western North Carolina. I'm also interested in how supply chains and businesses interact with science and production. And it's just a comment to say that I found your entire presentation very informative, particularly your focus on adaptability and resilience. So I also see this as an increased focus within the supply chain. Thank you for your presentation, Kevin.
Thanks, Ellie. That's it's a really nice question, and a really important one too, right? This is all we need to integrate more. And so part of how we do this are through like extension agents. So extension agents will kind of help us translate our science to stakeholders, right? And that might include local businesses, right? But then, that sometimes is less sufficient, and we have to think of new ways to kind of communicate, right? And this is where we try to do events, like things hosted through the Sustainability Office, for example. Science Everywhere is another one that just happened this last weekend. So these types of events is how we try to get some connections formed with these businesses, but largely we don't do enough of it, not nearly enough, right? So finding ways to link in with the community is something we're always trying to do as well. So yeah, it's a good point, and yeah, we're still working on it.
Yeah, I know NC-A&T and NC State specifically have their cooperative extension programs that are across the entire state for their specialties. And it's always a challenge for a university to be able to expand beyond its campus like that.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I did put a link to Peabody Park in the chat, and it's got a long history. The woods used to be much bigger space on campus. So Brian, to answer your question, I also serve on the committee and have been serving on it for the past 6 years. We manage education and outreach. So we were responsible for developing the website. We're redeveloping a map. We're also now a pollinator-friendly campus. And so we coordinate with, there's a committee specifically for that, and we coordinate with them, and we're developing new native habitats that are pollinator-friendly, kind of gardens and sanctuaries on campus. Removing invasive species. We're undergoing some studies of how to do some stream restoration. So we're kind of just, people come to us for advice, or if they're going to do a project, and we help manage or track the research that's going on in the park. So anything that we do doesn't interfere with the research that students and faculty are doing as well. Yep. Yeah, you're welcome. We're a little over time, but if there's one more question, I think that would be it. And otherwise, we'll adjourn. Okay, well, thanks again, Kevin. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us.